Hey everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Mei Lee Show. How are you? I hope you're doing okay and hanging in there and staying safe. I know it's been a couple weeks since I've done an episode, and it's a couple of reasons. I needed to take a little bit of a break, but also it's been a busy several weeks in terms of all of the anti-Asian assaults and crimes that have been taking place across the country. And it's been overwhelming, right? We all know this. It's been a daily occurrence, sometimes multiple times a day. We're hearing about these attacks, burglaries, vandalism, just, inexplicable assaults. And it is incredibly overwhelming. It's incredibly frustrating, and it's incredibly stressful. I know for those of us who are covering these stories, especially those journalists, reporters who are on the streets covering these stories and getting these, tips sent to them and stories and videos sent to them on a daily basis, it's traumatic. Dion Lim, who is a reporter up in San Francisco, she's been very aggressive about covering a lot of these anti-Asian incidents. And she said on a social media post recently that she had spoken to an expert, a mental health expert, who said that people like her, who are inundated with these visuals and these stories on a daily basis, suffering from secondary trauma. And I think that can be said for a lot of us who are seeing this and hearing about it on a daily basis, this barrage of horrible news. And so, the light in all of this darkness is that there is an increased awareness now and an admission and acknowledgement that this is a problem. This is a growing crisis, that it is not just being spoken about within the AAPI community. Now it's the broader community that's taking notice, that's paying attention. Mainstream media is now talking about it and covering it and getting people on the air to talk about it. And we're seeing the broader and general public also, commenting on it and, finally realizing that this is happening, and it has been happening for over a year now. So that is at least some positive result out of all of this evil that is developing. And that at least is heartening to a certain extent, because that is the beginning of awareness, then hopefully will lead to change and education and information and people really embracing this. And then that, that triggers empathy and sympathy, understanding, right? Not thinking that Asians, there's no problem. There's been no history of oppression or racism or being mistreated. No, there is a history of that. And now we need to take this opportunity to better inform our own community and as well as the general public. Only then, with that kind of understanding and awareness, can change really happen, and not just temporary change, systemic long-term change. That's what we want. That's what we want. Now, in all of this, one of the themes that I keep seeing and debates that I keep seeing come up and cause for conflict is the idea of hate crimes, right? Something being deemed as a hate crime. And for a lot of us, when we see these videos of elderly Asians being pushed to the ground, and in one case, the 84-year-old man who was killed, the Thai man, Vichar Ratanapakdee, he was killed. But then we see a woman being shoved and, hitting her head. We see all of these incidents where it seems like it's racially motivated. And we wonder, wait, why isn't this being considered and treated as a hate crime? One situation that really made my head spin, and I know a lot of other people's heads spin, was in New York. The 36-year-old man who was walking through Chinatown, and all of a sudden from behind, he is stabbed in the back by a stranger. And this person then turned himself into the police that night saying he did it and he didn't fucking care if he died or not. I mean, he was that graphic about it. But he, officials initially said that they were going to charge him with a hate crime. But then a few days later, we find out that that was actually not filed in that way. So for some reason, authorities changed their mind about pushing this as a hate crime. So that caused a lot of frustration as well, for obvious reasons, because why did they flip? In other cases, there is no hate crime charge. It's just an assault charge or a murder charge. In the case of the 84-year-old gentleman who was killed, that is just being treated as murder. But the DA caused a lot of controversy because he apparently said in an interview to the New York Times that this was a case of a young man having a temper tantrum. So that description, of course, it incited so much anger because people couldn't believe that that's how that murder and that attack would be spoken about, just a temper tantrum. So, and then another example is NBC Asian America, which is, online. And I know a lot of you read the articles and follow that, as I do. There was a recent article that a reporter had written, and it was entitled "Violence Against Asian Americans and Why Hate Crime Should Be Used Carefully." And then it goes on to say social media posts have conflated violence against people who are Asian American with hate crimes against the community at large, tying the crimes to pandemic racism. So this article triggered a lot of debate and created a huge divide, even within the Asian American community, because it was suggesting that we need to be very careful in using the term hate crime and trying to go after that kind of charge because it may not actually be deemed as a hate crime and it might cause more division. And we should treat every case fairly. Okay, fair enough, of course. I mean, that's law. But this really, really triggered a lot of anger and frustration. So here's what I decided to do. I, too, wanted more clarification in what is deemed as a hate crime and how a hate crime charge is filed properly. Like, what are the guidelines, right? What is the bar? Because apparently the bar for charging for a hate crime is pretty high and the burden of proof is higher. So I started doing some research myself, and I stumbled upon this opinion piece by Shan Wu. Now, Shan Wu is an attorney. He is a former federal prosecutor, and he is a CNN legal analyst. So those of you who watch CNN, you will see him appear on a pretty regular basis talking about legal issues and topics. Shan also served as counsel to former Attorney General Janet Reno. So he is definitely an experienced guy, knows the law, knows the intricacies of the law. And because he was a former prosecutor, he obviously knows the ins and outs of prosecuting crimes of this nature. So he wrote an op-ed for CNN just recently, and that was entitled "Anti-Asian Violence Must Be Charged as a Hate Crime." Bingo. So I was like, okay, I need to speak to Shan about this issue and have him explain what a hate crime is, how is it identified, but more importantly, how can it be prosecuted and why are prosecutors reluctant to go after that, right? They're sort of risk adverse. So I needed that kind of explanation, and I wanted to pass that along to you guys because I think it's really important. This is a complicated issue, and we need to understand the definition of it and how the law works and doesn't work and how we can make a difference in terms of how we look at this issue, look at this problem, and then demand action, okay? So he very generously agreed to give me an interview, which I was so happy about. And I was able to speak to him earlier. And so here is that interview with Shan Wu. And let me make one final note before we get into the interview. His name is pronounced Shan. And he even told me how to pronounce it properly before we started the interview. But I think throughout the interview, I kind of was flipping from Shan to Sean. So Shan, I apologize. I know exactly how to say your name. I don't know why I kept on doing that. But Shan Wu, here's that interview. Shan Wu, thank you so much for coming on the show. I am so grateful for your time to talk about this important issue.
Oh, happy to be here. Appreciate you having me.
And the reason I reached out to you, not only because I see you all the time on CNN and you always give great legal analysis, but you had also written an op-ed recently for CNN, just I think a week or so ago, about this very topic about hate crimes against Asians and why we should push for it more often. Let's first start off, though, with the problem. And that is, obviously, we're all talking about this explosion in hate crimes against, or crimes and assaults against Asians, by triple digits, quadruple digit percentages. What do you make of what's happening and why this is becoming such an incredibly pervasive problem?
I do think it is going to be strongly related to the racist words and associations that were done during the Trump administration. I mean, associating COVID with a particular race of people, obviously inaccurate and very racist. And that tends to fan a lot of flames. Historically, there have been various times where different minority groups, people of color, were targeted. Oftentimes there are economic reasons for that. The newest immigrants get picked on. Certainly for Asians in the country, historically, there's been a history of actual lynchings and massacres. Even in the Vincent Chin case, much later in the 1990s, that happened. And
we remember that one. Yep.
Right. And so I think there's that kind of fear out there of the pandemic, and then there are people who harbor just racist views. And when you have national leaders stoking that, it really becomes a very volatile situation. So I think that's definitely the cause, although, you wouldn't be able to scientifically link that, but I think everybody knows that's what's been going on.
I think that's pretty obvious, Shan. I mean, we've all been talking about it, for the last few years, and it's been made very clear. We got the videotape to prove it. We got the audio. Right. I mean, that's just been the case. But you referred to history, and I think what I have found is the lack of knowledge and education when it comes to the AAPI historical experience, which has a lot to do with what is still happening today, because that has compounded the idea of Asians not being fully accepted and excluded and treated as second-class citizens, dehumanized, et cetera, et cetera. So, all the way back to, like you mentioned, the lynching of Chinese in LA, right? In was it 1871?
1871, yeah. And there's the massacre there. There was another killing of Chinese workers later in the 19th century as well. And I mentioned in the opinion piece this terrible quote from the famous Judge Roy Bean, sort of a mythologized white jurist on the frontier, who had been quoted as saying, after he acquitted a person of killing a Chinese worker, he acquitted that man, and he said that he'd reviewed the entire Texas statutes and couldn't find any law that made it a crime to kill a, quote, damn Chinaman. And so a lot of times, first of all, I think, our community sometimes is unaware of that history. Many of our community are recent immigrants, don't necessarily know that. Right. So it's important to let them know that. And second of all, I think a lot of times people believe that is very old history. Oh, those are terrible things happened a long time ago. But I think the theme that's continued is the lack of justice for persons of color, and not just Asian Americans, of course. But if we focus on Asians, in neither of those cases, the lynching in Los Angeles or the massacre in Wyoming, were there any actual convictions brought. And then you fast forward to the 20th century in Detroit, the Vincent Chin murder in the 70s, where these men beat him with a baseball bat thinking he was a Japanese auto worker.
Right.
Again, there, charges were brought, not hate crime charges, at the state level. Judge gave them probation. And then even when the Justice Department, because of the great work of a lot of activists, Asian American activists, did bring federal hate crime charges. And it was actually the first time that they'd ever done that on behalf of an Asian victim.
Right.
One defendant was acquitted. The other got a sentence, which was then overturned on appeal. So at the end of the day, good effort, but still no justice.
Result.
So
Yeah.
it's something that, right, exactly. Something that continues right into the modern time. That's important for us all to remind each other of.
Right, right. Well, again, I'm glad you brought that up in your op-ed, and I've been continuing to say that as well. We need to educate not people within the AAPI community about our own history and experience, but also the general public, because I think there's a lack of understanding and therefore a lack of empathy when it comes to the AAPI experience. And therefore we're seen as maybe we haven't suffered, or we haven't struggled, we haven't been oppressed in any way. So why should we care about the situation now? So that, I think, is very important. And I think it begins at schools, but also begins with everyone in terms of just wanting to build up a better knowledge base when it comes to Asians and Asian Americans.
And I think, it, in a very sinister way, it dovetails in with the model minority myth. I mean, I've gotten, as you know, we all get negative feedback too, but I've gotten some negative feedback from the opinion piece with people saying, what are you Asians complaining about? You have it good. You're no different than white people.
Yeah.
And that's part of that. A lot of people think, oh, what's wrong with being a model minority? And that's actually one of the dark sides of it, which is people think nothing bad can happen to you. You're in a position of privilege, and they ignore the fact that while it's wonderful so many members of our community are successful academically, professionally, there's a huge population that is very poor, does not have those resources, and most likely they're the ones that are more vulnerable to being victimized.
That's right. That's right. And I'm so glad you brought up that point too, because I think even within the Asian community, there's almost a sense of guilt that we can't bring these issues up. No, we shouldn't complain because we have it better. Right. Maybe not, but it's okay. We should just not say anything. And so therefore we even perpetuate that stereotype in some ways because we're made to feel like you have it better. So, you should just deal with what you have. And, if you think this is a problem, well, it's not that bad of a problem. So again, it's that awareness of the reality rather than this myth that, we all know is not true, this model minority myth. So again, thank you so much for bringing up that point. Well, then, Shan, let's...
And so often, those communities have had bad experiences, right? Maybe with their own, let's say, home countries, an oppressive government.
Exactly.
They're frightened of the police. And that's a long time problem with immigrant communities. And that's part of the equation, too, when they're reluctant to call attention to themselves even.
Right. Yeah. Well, then let's talk about this issue of hate crimes. As I said to you when I first reached out in my email, I think this is such an important topic to discuss because, when we look at this video, all these videos that have gone viral of the elderly Asians who are being knocked over, and unfortunately one was killed, Vichar Ratanapakdee, we say to ourselves, how can this not be a hate crime, right? And because it's so obvious that they're being targeted, but explain to us in layman's terms why it's so difficult to, charge somebody with a hate crime versus, a regular charge of murder or attempted murder or assault. What is the biggest difference, and why don't we see more of this? And why do we see sometimes reversals? Because we saw that in New York with the man who stabbed the 36-year-old in the back. First, they said it was a hate crime. Then investigators said, no, actually, we're going to change our minds. It's not a hate crime. What's with, that just made our head spin, right?
So I think the high-level answer is it's not that difficult.
Okay.
But from a practical standpoint, there are definitely notions within the prosecutor's mind that have made it undercharged and underused. So let's break it down. So with a hate crime such as murder or physical assault, you will charge the so-called underlying crime, which is the assault, the violent act. And then on top of that, there may be a hate crime added to that, which is oftentimes what they call an enhancement of sentencing, which is if the defendant is convicted, it'll be a harsher sentence because it was motivated by hate.
Right.
And there are reasons why that's so important we can talk about from a sociological and policy standpoint. But when that case comes to the prosecutors, here's how they look at it. They look at it and say, well, we definitely got an assault here. We can prove that. We have video of the person being assaulted.
Right.
But how do I know what was inside that defendant's head? How do I know that his intent was motivated by hate or racial animus? So it's very helpful if they've written a manifesto.
Right, of course.
Right? And it's very helpful if they were yelling something racist when that happened. But you may not have that. You may have these sort of random attacks where there's no audio on the surveillance. And so you have a whole pattern of particular people of color, Asians, being targeted. But in each individual case, the prosecutor is wondering, how do I prove the intent in that person's head?
Yeah.
And so that's one stumbling block for the prosecutors from a practical standpoint. And the other, as you and I were talking about before we started the show, is prosecutors, like anybody else, they don't like to lose. and they tend to be somewhat risk averse because the stakes are high. They certainly don't want to lose a conviction of someone they believe has committed a crime. So they're afraid to add anything which might give them one more piece of the puzzle that they have to prove beyond a reasonable doubt. But as a former prosecutor myself, I've experienced that. I had a crime that I wanted to charge as a young prosecutor, which I thought was pretty blatant. And I was dissuaded from doing so for those reasons, which is you don't want to make it one more thing you got to prove. What's more important is just get the conviction. So I know that mindset that goes on in them. But
Can I jump in and ask you one question about that, though? When you are trying to prosecute a case such as, an assault or murder, and on top of that, a hate crime, even if you lose the hate crime charge, it's not that it's going to risk the charge and conviction of murder or assault, right? I mean, it's not as if you lose one, then the whole, game over. So why would that deter one to try to at least go for it all? But okay, maybe the hate crime will not be, they won't get a conviction there, but they know, because they have the proof and evidence, they know that the assault charge will likely be convicted because it's all on tape and they have the proof. So I got to understand why they look at it as like all or nothing. Or is that the case? I don't know. I'm just trying to understand.
Yeah, no, you're exactly right. Particularly at the state level, the federal charge is a little bit different because those are typically situations where the state has either failed to act, and so DOJ, Department of Justice, is acting purely on a federal level. With those, it's a little bit more intrinsically tied to finding the violation of civil rights and the motivation. But at the state level, you're absolutely right. It's pretty clean. These tend to be sentencing enhancements. So even if the jury were to decide, we don't have enough evidence that this was motivated by hate, they could still, of course, convict on what they see and the evidence is of the assault.
Right.
But here's what the prosecutors are worried about. And this is happening all across the spectrum with criminal cases. They are concerned that if one charge they bring is weak or the defendant is acquitted on that one charge, then there's a domino effect that it may cause the jury to start thinking, overall, this is an overcharged case. Prosecution is being too aggressive. They don't have the evidence for it. Why are they doing that? So they're worried that, like a little loose thread, right? You pull on the thread, the whole thing comes unraveled.
Right.
That's what they're concerned about. So it's not so much of a legal issue of all or nothing, but they're very concerned that any loss, any weakness in the case could hurt the overall case. So that's what they're concerned about.
So from your professional opinion, and also, like you said, you had a personal experience as a prosecutor when you were a young prosecutor. You mentioned this in your op-ed, that you still regret not having pushed for that hate crime charge because you thought it was so obvious. Then where are we at then in terms of trying to raise the level of hate crime charges? Because if this is the case, if most prosecutors feel this way and they're risk adverse, then hate crimes are really never going to be taken very seriously, are they?
That is a concern. Certainly, historically, that's been a problem. But I think the way to change that is twofold. First, from a more analytical aspect, the intent issue is not as overwhelming an issue as the prosecutors think, because let's take our typical example of murder, which everyone sees a lot of shows about.
Yeah.
This idea of premeditated murder, right. It may be a layperson's idea that we think premeditated means you had a big plan, you were waiting to carry it out. But in fact, showing premeditated murder all across the country every day in cases, you can form that intent in a split second. It's just had the intent at that moment, it was premeditated. It wasn't just an accident, like you were having a fight and accidentally the person was hurt.
Right.
You intended to kill that person. So prosecutors deal with that all the time, and they don't have a manifesto. They don't have the defendant yelling, "I'm going to kill you." They prove the intent from the circumstances there. And so that's one thing that they need to, I think, expand their thinking, be a little bit more courageous about, to realize it's not that different from those other cases where you prove intent. Intent, you always have to prove by circumstances because you can't get inside the person's head.
Right.
As a community, what we can do is really raise our voices to ask that they bring these cases. They won't bring the cases all the time. They won't charge hate crimes all the time. But if we aren't asking, if we aren't forcing them to think about it, then it's really not going to happen very much at all. And prosecutors, even those who are not elected ones, they are political animals because everyone is. They react to what their community, that's their clientele, are telling them.
Sure.
And so does society. I think, quite a few years ago, 19th century, early 20th century, you would have killings of African Americans, lynchings, where clearly the bulk of that local community did not even think of that as a crime.
Right.
And as time began to evolve and societal differences became more apparent, how they changed their thinking, that came about because of the community forcing that change.
Yep.
And prosecutors in the law react to that. So that's why the community involvement is so important, to make them start to think differently about these cases.
Very good point. And I think that's why I love seeing that this level of awareness is exploding and the demands are really strengthening. We're hearing from all AAPI community and beyond on this issue. So the pressure is on. We got to sustain that to actually, enact some changes. But from a legal perspective then, Shan, are there some changes that you think should be made in the law to allow for better conviction and better chances of hate crime conviction?
Yeah, generally, I am a conservative when it comes to wanting to enact new laws in reaction to issues. I think many times laws on the books would be fine so long as we use them. And one concern, of course, is if you have a crime in the books and you never use it, it's the same as just taking it off the books. I think one thing that could be studied, and this, you have to study it very carefully, it's a little bit of a radical notion, is you could look at the hate crime enhancement like elder abuse, which is when a particular class of people is the victim and that's proven, then that automatically results in that enhancement. So with an elder abuse case, like in Vichar's case, they are charging the elder abuse. You don't have to do a lot to show intent to pick on the elderly. It's enough that the person is elderly.
Right.
And so it's an interesting idea that when you're having a big problem with violence directed at a class of people, that you might protect that class, as we do in other civil rights statutes, to say that if you're convicted of assaulting an Asian American, then you are eligible for this enhancement because there's been a lot of violence directed at them. Now, that would be very controversial.
Yeah.
Have to think it through. People who are not people of color, might react by saying, hey, what about us? We matter too. How come people are getting special treatment? It could sow some divisiveness in the community. And so we have to be careful of that. But that could be a legal answer to looking at it, but it has to be studied carefully. I think the immediate short-term, more conservative approach is, let's really bear down and use the tools that are already on the books for this purpose.
Mm-hmm. But I'm still a little lost on the notion of having to prove intent in terms of that person had to have in his head that he is doing this because this person is Asian and I'm a racist, right? So that's a high burden of proof, isn't it? Unless, again, like you said, somebody has a manifesto or, there is a track record online, on social media, all of that. So that then I have to say, Shan, I mean, I think about it, I'm like, well, God, how do you even go about proving that? So therefore, if I were a prosecutor, I would probably feel like, wow, this is going to be next to impossible. Again, even in the case of Vichar, right? The 84-year-old Thai man. What would you, okay, this is what I'm going to ask you. If you were the prosecutor, what would you do? How would you go about trying to prosecute this case?
Well, I'll go over the first obvious things which you've already mentioned, which is, of course, if he had any social media, if he'd spoken to friends, etc., any of that evidence of intent, very important. You got to carefully comb through that. Here's the other aspect of it. Thinking a little bit out of the box, how many other people did that defendant pass that morning? What other people were around? There are other surveillance cameras. He didn't just arrive there and transport it right in front of the victim.
Right.
He did not select other victims. And using that point, who he did select would be evidence of the bias and why pick him. Now, he has a right not to testify, so he doesn't have to answer that question. But frankly, from a very strategic standpoint as a prosecutor, you want to put pressure on the defendants to do things, to testify, because prosecutors love it if a defendant testifies. I mean, just always completely slice and dice them because it's very hard to defend yourself when you're being cross-examined. That would bring pressure to say, look at the circumstances here. He is an Asian elderly man walking. You passed other people that day. You picked on him.
Right.
And there might be a way to bring in some of the pattern of violence that's happening against Asians. The defense would fight that a great deal. But to even, again, this is thinking outside the box, trying to be more aggressive with this. You can bring in the fact that the general attitude in the country has been affected by associating COVID with Asians. And if the judge allows that, you can bring that in, that this is something that's in society right now. People are aware of that. It's going to be in his mind as well. And of the various people he encountered that morning, this is the person he selected. Right. Make sense, push against that. Obviously, they have a right to do that. But those are some of the ways that they need to think more creatively about this, not just rely on the social media or the manifesto.
Do you think there's a lack of creativity then when it comes to prosecutors?
Oh, yes.
Okay. I'm glad you answered that truthfully, because clearly there is, because I think, again, you're saying if they're already risk adverse, they're certainly not going to think out of the box and try to be creative. Take, for instance, the case of the other gentleman, I shouldn't say gentleman, the other suspect who stabbed the 36-year-old Asian man in Chinatown in New York. And this is a guy, this suspect, gave himself up to the police, said he did it, and then he actually had assaulted another Asian man back in January. So why, again, isn't that being used as evidence to charge him with a hate crime on top of the the attempted murder? If there is some sort of track record. Again, this is the case, everyone, that initially they were going to charge him for a hate crime, and then they backtracked and said they were not.
Yeah, I think, so first of all, that other evidence should be used. There's a whole complex doctrine called other crimes, and it's used to show intent. A great example, Bill Cosby, this time around, they brought in all these other victims, some of whom he was not charged with assaulting, but it's sort of the MO, modus operandi, that he does this kind of thing before. Right. So as prosecutors, you would seek to bring up that point, that he had attacked another Asian person as well, and that shows his intent right there. Defense will fight that, say that's prejudicial, but that's what you do as a prosecutor. One thing that's important to keep in mind is that initial decision to charge as a hate crime may have been hasty. I mean, they may have been reacting with a visceral sense to community pressure, right, and they saw this as, oh no, another incident, let's charge it right away. So while I criticize prosecutors for being risk averse, you also don't want to act too hastily and charge something and then have to retract it. I think you have to study the circumstances first and take a look at that evidence. But certainly the fact that he has attacked another Asian there's a very strong argument to bring that in to show what his intent was here. Right. Absolutely.
It does send mixed signals, obviously, though, from a legal perspective and a law enforcement perspective, if they flip-flop on something so serious. And so for the AAPI community, they're understandably upset about that because first, they got the charge and then all of a sudden it's reversed and now there's confusion over what they're going to do. So Shan, I'm just wondering that in terms of all the changes we are seeing and all the symbolic gestures from the president, for instance, President Biden signing that memorandum, to condemn, anti-Asian hate and assaults and crimes, and the different legislation that we've seen. I think it was late last year when a congresswoman in New York helped to pass a bill that all it was saying is we condemn anti-Asian racism and we want to support the community and all of that. Everyone in the House voted, all Democrats voted in favor. Not one Republican voted for that bill. Right. Not one. Right. And that just sent such an unbelievably negative signal, of course, that they don't give a crap, right? So something as, I thought, as neutral as that, like how could you not vote for something? How could you not support that? So again, we are living in a very divided country, as you know. Do you think enough is being done legislatively on the federal level, state, level to take this seriously, or do you think more needs to be done?
I think more needs to be done. While it may be true that a statement like that, an announcement from the president, or even just a resolution, in and of itself doesn't have any teeth, doesn't cause more prosecutions, I think it does send out a very important message. It sends out and so the states could do this, governors could make these proclamations. It sends out a message to the prosecutors that this is important to the leader of the state. It sends out a message to the victimized community that this counts, and therefore, if we come forward, people may care and want to help us with it. And it actually sends out a message to people who might be prone to doing this type of hatred, to acting on racism or racist beliefs that they have, that, hey, higher up is saying we're not going to tolerate that. So those sorts of statements are important from higher up leaders because it makes that difference. And it kind of goes to the whole point of why we have hate crimes. People sometimes ask, why do we have a hate crime? We can just, person murder someone's terrible, let's just charge them with the murder. The reason is that you have to show the people being victimized that the system works for them and cares for them. And there is a big disincentive to violent haters when they realize that they're going to be held accountable for that hate, not just the crime. And that's the whole point of having the hate crimes. It goes back to the original reason for it. So those sorts of statements, legislation are very important, even if they aren't directly related to the prosecution itself.
Right. Shan, let me ask you about your personal experiences, because I think you and me and so many other Asians growing up in America have had pretty negative experiences with racism and anti-Asian hate and bullying and all of that. I just wrote an article for NextShark about my own experiences in the past because I wanted people to know that this is not a new problem that has just arisen because of COVID. Racism against Asians has been, as we said at the beginning, historically, right, throughout the history of America. But you too, you went through as a child the bullying and the the racist assaults and all of that. So can you share with me how that has impacted you throughout your life?
Sure. When I was a schoolboy, I was in actually Westchester County, and in public school, I was bullied. There are older boys who used to beat me up during recess and call me racist terms, associate me with the Viet Cong, et cetera. And at some points I tried to fight back, got beaten up. They were bigger, and I think two things grew out of that. One, I think I later actually became an amateur boxer, in part sort of like trying to work through that insecurity, because you feel like a failure that you weren't able to defend yourself. You were afraid, so you were cowardly. So that sort of effect psychologically is really bad, very devastating for a lot of young people.
Yeah.
And I was fortunate. I had a lot of good support from my parents. I overcame that. But, for kids who don't have that kind of support, difficult socioeconomic circumstances, that can be really devastating. And even for me, my dad was actually a human rights commissioner in New York City. And I feel like I grew up with a very strong sense of cultural identity and pride in it. But I remember as a youngster when that was happening, saying to my mom, I hate being Chinese. I wish I'd never been born Chinese. And that's such a common feeling for kids to have about all sorts of things. I hate wearing glasses, I hate being short, whatever it is. But when it's a immutable characteristic like that, a racial identity, it has such devastating consequences for them as they mature. And that's something that's a tough one. And we really got to work on that.
Yeah. Shan, I shared that experience. I remember saying that to my mother. I said, I wish I wasn't Korean. Right. I mean, I think that's, again, a shared identity crisis that a lot of us grew up with because of the circumstances, because we were made to feel less than. We were made to feel as if we did not belong and there was something wrong with us. And this was our identity, that we cannot change our race. We cannot change our ethnicity. And we were made to feel ashamed by it. And that is what's so heartbreaking about what's still going on. Children still being made to feel this way. I just read a Washington Post article saying that a lot of Asian kids and their parents do not want to go back to school because they're afraid of the increase in bullying because of what's been going on. So that just broke my heart when I saw that. So then let me ask you, Shan, from a personal point of view, I know you have kids, right?
Yes, two daughters.
Two daughters. And I'm sure you're probably a bit fearful for them. Are they afraid too?
Well, I think the younger one who's in high school, we're not in school physically right now, but even when COVID first started, I mean, she also reported and experienced more incidents like that in school. The kids are having that. And I think the older one, who is a young adult working, does encounter issues on the street when she's walking around. And so, as a parent, I mean, that's a big strain. And I think what's really wearing on our community is that's the sort of thing that you can't guard against it. You don't know where it's going to come from. A friend of mine, Korean American woman, mom working in DC, I was talking to her the other day and she recounted a story where she'd been at a stoplight and a man came up sort of yelling racist things and was banging on her windshield, trying her door. And that's something you have no idea is coming. You don't feel you can guard yourself against that. So that kind of helplessness, I think, is very debilitating on people's psyche.
And may I ask, Shan, are your parents still with us, or have they?
My dad passed away, but my mom is still with us, and she's actually been following this issue and has asked me a lot of questions about it. I mean, as someone of that generation who came here as an immigrant from China, she's seen a lot of the prejudice over time. And it's very disheartening for her that at this stage in our democracy that there's been this resurgence of this sort of hateful actions and feelings. Yeah.
And I'm sure like me, you are somewhat concerned about your mother too. My mom is 84. And, when we see all these attacks, I tell her, I'm like, I don't want you to go anywhere. And that's terrible too, right? I mean, don't go anywhere because of COVID, and she's now vaccinated, but still now because of this, that's extra level of anxiety for us to all deal with our elderly parents, kids. I mean, it's across the board. So, but last question then, Shan, what would you like to see happen? Just overall, I know this is a big question, but what would you tell our community and then the general public about what, more needs to be done to combat this problem?
Well, I think I would tell our community that it's important to express the concerns, and not everyone has to go out and protest, but reporting it, talking to law enforcement, not to be shy about it, because if we don't, first of all, if you don't report the incident, they can't do anything about it. Police can't prosecute something with no evidence.
Exactly.
But also by talking about it more, telling police, telling prosecutors, it will slowly, hopefully, start to change their viewpoint, make them somewhat more aggressive. And from a bigger macro picture, I think one thing that's really, really important is that we have to guard against, as a community, being turned against other people of color. And you will see that sometimes in the greater majorities, people trying that, and sometimes even from other people of color having resentment against this issue. And that's so important because this is not about one group being pitted against the other. It's about hatred, and all groups have suffered from that. So that's something that's really important to be careful of as we think about this. It's so important not to get tricked into thinking of this as, oh, it's one immigrant group against the other, it's one minority group against the other. It's really about a hatred problem and protecting all of us. And that's really, really important to get that message out there.
And thank you for saying that, because I think that's extremely important to make a point of that. Shan, I'm going to ask you one totally unrelated question.
Okay.
Is Donald Trump in big legal trouble?
I think I think the answer to that is yes. After a lot of false starts, no. I think the answer to that is yes. Really, for two reasons. One, from a more theoretical standpoint, since he is no longer a sitting president, a lot of the actual legal impediments, for example, DOJ won't charge a sitting president, have been removed, but also a lot of the sort of traditional impediments, which is major public figures, politicians. The reason some of those rules exist is because prosecutors don't want to be seen as being overtly political. So they try and stay away from that. That's why DOJ is careful about subpoenaing congressmen's records, et cetera. With him out of office, that's very different. There's certainly never been an ex-president who has, so much baggage in terms of potential criminal liability. So he no longer has that deference. He doesn't have the legal protection. The second reason is really just the proof's in the pudding, which is that there are active investigations going on. The Manhattan DA's investigation is fully active. They finally got access to the tax records.
Right.
If the former president was my client and I knew about that investigation and he was asking me, should I take this seriously? I was like, yeah, you better take this seriously. I mean, they've subpoenaed your tax records.
Right.
They're talking to your CFO. That's very serious legal jeopardy. So the answer is no question about it. He is in serious jeopardy.
I always remember reading that Al Capone didn't get sent to prison for all the other crimes he committed, the heinous crimes he committed. He got sent to prison because of tax evasion, right?
Right.
They got him on that. So I
absolutely
kind of equate that to maybe this situation of, maybe they get him somehow, but whatever it takes, But I'm a little biased, but okay.
Yeah.
I had to ask
you.
The
important thing to remember about the Al Capone analogy is the reason they wanted to look at his taxes was because he had done all those other terrible things.
Right. Well, exactly. Exactly. Yeah. So all right. Well, thank you. I thank you for answering that question. I was so curious about that, just because I'm very biased. I think he did so much harm to this country, but especially when it comes to the Asian American, crisis right now of racism, he certainly threw fuel on that fire. So, not a good man, but anyway, but you're a good man, Shan. Thank you so much for your time. And I think this is going to be extremely helpful for the viewers and listeners to better understand the issue of hate crimes and charges and convictions and the behavior. So this is going to be extremely, extremely informative. So thank you so much.
Oh, you're very welcome. So glad to be a part of it. And, thank you with your particular history and your strong voice. I mean, it's so important that you're looking at this. So thank you.
Oh, you're so welcome. My pleasure. And please take care, stay safe, and let's talk again soon.
Sounds good.
Okay.
All right.
So appreciate Shan Wu coming on the show to give us that clearer explanation, because I think we all, knowledge is power, and we all need to continue to inform ourselves so that we can be better ambassadors in this fight. If we don't have that knowledge, if we don't have that information, then we can't put up a good argument or a strong argument in favor of our cause. So hopefully that information that we talked about today is going to help you become better informed. I know it did for me, for sure. But, this is an issue that we all care about deeply, and we all want to see a difference made. And like Shan was suggesting, we have the power, right? District attorneys all over the country, they may or may not be elected, but they know that they have to satisfy their constituents or the public that they serve. So if we stay silent, that's not going to pressure them in any way to make any kind of change or to maybe consider a more serious charge of a hate crime. So we need to speak up and push for those kinds of charges and convictions, or else they're not going to care. Why would they care? And so that's one way to make your voice heard, because if you want to see that change, you have to let them know. And also we should let our elected officials know that more maybe legislation or at least some movement and recognition needs to be done and made when it comes to anti-Asian hate and anti-Asian rhetoric and anti-Asian violence. So yes, you might think it's just talk and it's just words, but words matter. Leadership matters. And when they make it public, it matters. People listen to that to a certain extent. So, but if they don't hear it from us, and if we don't make those demands and those phone calls and those emails and those tweets, they're not going to take up that cause, especially if they don't relate to it in any way, right? If you're a white guy sitting in an office, in political office, you're not going to relate to this incident or these situations unless they hear from us. And we count because we're voters, okay? We're the constituents. So you got to make that effort as well. And again, like Shan said, we need to report these incidents. We cannot stay silent. We cannot go by those old ways of just keeping our head down and minding our own business. We need to report these incidents, these crimes, these assaults when they happen, because if they're not reported, the authorities will never know about them and they won't care. All right. So those are some action steps that are very doable for all of us, and we need to take that very, very seriously. One final note, there's a lot of organizations working on trying to raise awareness, trying to raise money for the different causes. But one that began just about a week ago, the gardener next door right now is working in my neighbor's yard. So of course, when I'm recording, he has to turn on the leaf blower. Okay, anyway, I think you can hear me though. So there is a GoFundMe campaign started by Stop Asian Hate. So if you just go, just search on GoFundMe the hashtag Stop Asian Hate, and they have been able to put together sort of a bigger umbrella group of raising money for different causes, for different victims, for Asian businesses, things like that, different organizations, grassroots organizations that all have the same purpose, to combat this racism and help Asian businesses and individuals and organizations. So check that out. You can donate, and you can also learn all about the different causes and organizations and efforts that are going on. Okay, so, this is a slow and steady race, right? This isn't going to happen overnight. And we certainly can't think that it's just going to be a flash in the pan. We get all this attention and everybody goes away. No. You got to stick it out. This is a marathon, okay, not a sprint. And we have to stay consistent and we have to stay committed. I'm tired and I'm stressed out, I'm frustrated and I'm angry, but that keeps me going, believe it or not. And so all of those emotions we need to use towards something positive. And that positive thing being, we want systemic, long-term, permanent change for the better. Okay. All right, everyone. Thanks for listening. Thanks for watching. Until next time, everyone, please stay safe and let's keep up the fight. All right. See ya.